They thought leaving me behind was a punishment. They had no idea it was the moment I'd been waiting for. My brother's wedding was supposed to be the event of the decade. At least, that's how my mother described it every single day for 18 months. The venue deposit alone cost more than my yearly salary. The guest list had 240 names on it. The rehearsal dinner was at a steakhouse where the cheapest item on the menu was a $40 side of asparagus. My mother had a binder, a literal 3-inch binder, color-coded by category, laminated dividers, sticky tabs, the whole thing. She carried it everywhere like it was a second child. The child she actually cared about. I am the oldest. My brother is 3 years younger than me, and from the moment he got engaged to his college girlfriend, I became invisible in my own family. Or rather, I became useful in a different way. Not as a daughter, as staff. It started small. Could I pick up the centerpiece samples from the florist? Could I call the caterer back because my mother had a conflict? Could I drive 40 minutes to the venue on a Tuesday to check if the chairs had arrived? I said yes every time. I told myself this was what families did. I told myself my brother only gets married once. I told myself I was being a good sister. I should have read the binder more carefully. My name appeared 47 times in that binder. I counted later, not as a bridesmaid. My brother's fiancée had her own friends for that. I appeared as a task doer. Confirm parking logistics, Claire. Pick up alterations for Grandma, Claire. Coordinate shuttle schedule with driver, Claire. 47 line items across 18 months, and not once did anyone ask if I had the time, the bandwidth, or frankly, the desire to do any of it. I had a job, a real one. I worked as a junior financial analyst at a mid-sized logistics company in Charlotte. I was 31 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house, which apparently made me the most available person in the family, despite working 45 hours a week. My brother lived 6 blocks from my parents. He was home for dinner twice a week, but he was the groom. He had things to focus on. I was just Claire. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in layers. Layer 1 was 8 months before the wedding, when my mother called me at work, during a meeting I had explicitly told her about, to ask me to drive to 3 different bakeries and pick up tasting samples, because she and my future sister-in-law had a spa day they didn't want to reschedule. I left the meeting. I drove to the bakeries. I told myself it was fine. Layer 2 was 4 months out, when I found out the bridesmaids were flying to Nashville for a bachelorette weekend. I wasn't invited. When I mentioned it to my mother, she said very gently, very casually, "Well, you're not really in the wedding party, sweetheart." I stood in her kitchen holding a stack of addressed invitation envelopes I had spent the previous Sunday afternoon stamping and stacking, and I smiled and said I understood. Layer 3 was 6 weeks before the wedding when my parents sat me down at the dining room table, the good one, with the leaf in, which meant something was happening, and explained the plan. My father did most of the talking. He always did. He had this way of delivering news like it was already decided. Like your feelings about it were a formality he was politely acknowledging before moving on. He told me that because the wedding was in Savannah, a 5-hour drive, and because there was a lot happening, they had decided it made the most sense for me to stay back in Charlotte. I waited for the rest of the sentence. For the reason that would make this make sense. Someone needs to stay with your grandmother, my father said. She can't make the trip. You know how she gets in the car. My grandmother, who was 83, who had mild mobility issues but was otherwise sharp as a tack and had a full-time aide named Rosaria who came every weekday, who, when I called her the next day, told me she had specifically told my parents she would be fine and that I should go to the wedding. They told me you volunteered, my grandmother said. There was a long pause on the line. Did you volunteer, Claire? I had not volunteered. I told my grandmother I'd handle it. I told her not to worry. I got off the phone and sat on the floor of my apartment for a while, just sitting there, doing the math. 18 months of free labor. 47 line items, 2 missed work meetings, 1 stamped Sunday, 1 Nashville weekend I wasn't invited to, and now, my brother's wedding. The thing this entire 18 months had been building toward. I was not going. But here's the thing about being treated like staff for long enough. You start paying attention the way staff pays attention. You notice things. You hear things. You file things away because you're in the room, but no one thinks of you as a person who is really listening. I had been listening for a long time. My father owned a residential property management company, about 30 units across 4 small apartment complexes in the greater Charlotte area, plus a small commercial strip he picked up 8 years ago. Nothing massive, but profitable. He had an office manager named Dennis, who had been with him for 12 years, and every spring they had their books reviewed by the same accountant, a man named Gerald, who played golf with my father, and whose review, as far as I could tell, consisted mostly of nodding. I had a finance degree. I had been working in financial analysis for 6 years, and for the past 2 years I had been doing my father's bookkeeping as a favor, because Dennis left and they needed someone temporary, and my father asked, and I said yes, because I always said yes. I was not paid for this either. What I was, though, was careful. I kept my own records. Not because I suspected anything at first. I just liked things clean. I built a simple spreadsheet tracking income by unit, maintenance expenses, vendor payments. It was the kind of thing I did automatically, the same way some people doodle. The numbers started bothering me about 8 months into doing the books. Not screaming alarm bothering me, just a low hum. A few vendor invoices for a maintenance company I'd never heard of. Ridgeline Property Services appearing regularly, always just under the threshold that would trigger additional review. Payments going out, but no corresponding work orders in the system. I asked my father about it once, casually. He said Ridgeline handled some exterior work and he'd sort out the documentation. The documentation never appeared. I kept my spreadsheet. I kept my copies of the invoices. I kept every email I'd been CC'd on related to the books. I am not sure when I decided that this information was important. I think it was the Nashville weekend. I think it was standing in my mother's kitchen with those envelopes. I think it was the dining room table with the leaf in. I think by the time my father explained the grandmother plan, I had already decided, somewhere quiet inside me, that I was done being convenient. The wedding was on a Saturday in April. My family left Thursday morning. My parents, my brother, and his fiancée, various aunts and uncles, cousins I barely knew. My grandmother's aide Rosaria came at 8 as usual. My grandmother and I had coffee and watched a game show, and she told me about her own wedding in 1963, and I really did love her, whatever else was happening. I had already made an appointment for the previous Tuesday. The IRS whistleblower office has a formal submission process. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing mine. I am not going to pretend I just dashed something off. I had 6 years of financial analysis experience and 2 years of direct access to the books, and I built a submission that was thorough, organized, and documented. I laid out the Ridgeline invoices. I showed the pattern, the amounts, the frequency, the absence of any corresponding service records. I cross-referenced what I'd found with property tax filings I pulled from public records. I included every email I had. I submitted it all digitally on that Tuesday, 2 days before my family drove to Savannah for the wedding of the century. Then I went to my grandmother's house on Saturday, drank coffee, and watched my brother's wedding live stream on her iPad. Because yes, they had set up a live stream, though no one had thought to mention that to me directly. My grandmother held my hand during the vows. Rosaria made us lunch. It was, honestly, a fine day. What happened next did not happen quickly. I want to be clear about that, because I have seen enough movies to know that people expect the dramatic knock at the door, the immediate consequence, the satisfying same-day justice. That is not how this works. The IRS does not move fast. Federal investigations do not move fast. What they do is move thoroughly. I heard nothing for 4 months. During those 4 months, I continued my life. I got a small promotion at work. I stopped doing my father's bookkeeping. I simply stopped showing up, and when my father asked why, I said I needed to focus on my own job. He seemed annoyed but not alarmed. He hired someone else. I wonder sometimes what that someone else found. My relationship with my family during those months was careful. My mother called to share wedding photos. My brother and his wife sent a thank you card that thanked me for all my help with the planning, in a way that told me he had no idea how much help I had actually provided, or what form it had taken. My father was civil. Everything was normal on the surface, and I let it be normal because I knew what was underneath, and I did not need to poke at it. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon in August. It was not from the IRS directly. It was from a Charlotte attorney named Ms. Point Okafor, who had been referred to me by a legal aid contact I'd had the foresight to consult back in the spring. She told me the investigation was active and that investigators might want to speak with me as a cooperating source. She told me I should have a lawyer for that conversation. I already had her. I will skip the middle part because it is full of things I am not going to discuss publicly. Meetings, documents, questions I answered as honestly and completely as I could. What I will say is that the investigation did not stay small. Ridgeline Property Services turned out to be a shell company. The money cycling through it connected to a pattern that extended well beyond those 4 apartment complexes. There were personal expenses run through the business. There were insurance claims that did not hold up. There were things my mother either knew about or chose a very deliberate kind of not knowing about, and the investigators had their own opinions about which it was. My father was indicted 11 months after I filed. I did not tell my family it was me. I did not need to. My father is not a stupid man, limited in his empathy, perhaps, but not stupid. He knew who had access. He knew who understood the numbers. The moment his lawyer started asking about document sources, he would have known. My mother called me the night the news broke locally. She didn't say anything for a long moment after I picked up. Then she said, "How could you do this to your family, Claire?" Not a question. A statement. I thought about the binder. I thought about Nashville. I thought about the dining room table with the leaf in. I thought about 47 line items and 2 years of unpaid bookkeeping and the coffee I drank with my grandmother while my brother got married 5 hours away. "I didn't do anything to my family, Mom," I said. "I did something for myself." She hung up. My brother called the following week. The conversation was longer and harder, and I will not recreate it here, except to say that at one point he said he felt like he didn't know me, and I said very calmly that was because no one in this family had ever tried. He didn't have an answer for that. We haven't spoken since, but I think about that silence a lot. The silence of someone recognizing something true and not being ready to do anything with it yet. My father pled guilty to several counts of tax fraud and wire fraud 14 months after the indictment. The sentencing guidelines for what he was convicted of put him at 8 to 12 years. He received 9. The commercial strip was seized. 2 of the apartment complexes were seized. The accounts connected to Ridgeline were frozen and eventually forfeited. My mother sold the house. She is living with my aunt now, 2 states away. She does not contact me. I received a whistleblower award. The IRS Whistleblower Award program pays between 15 and 30% of collective proceeds in eligible cases. I am not going to state the exact number here, but I will tell you it changed my life in a material and permanent way. I am no longer a junior analyst. I started my own small financial consulting firm 8 months ago. Just me and 2 contractors working with small businesses on exactly the kind of compliance and bookkeeping issues I apparently have some experience with. I moved to a new apartment. I have a balcony now. I have a plant on the balcony that I have managed not to kill, which feels like progress. My grandmother still calls me on Sundays. She does not talk about my father. She talks about her garden and the game shows and a novel she's reading, and sometimes she tells me stories about being young and how many things she wishes she had done differently, and how few of them she actually regrets. Last month, she told me that the bravest thing a person can do is stop making themselves small for people who will never fully see them anyway. She said she'd been waiting years to tell me that. I think about what I lost. I try to be honest about it. I lost a version of my family that I think I already knew was never quite real. The version where I was loved the same way I was expected to give, without condition or scorecard. I lost the ability to pretend that version existed. I do not know if that counts as loss or as the end of a very long, expensive illusion. What I kept was this: my grandmother's Sunday calls, my own name on the door of my own business, the feeling, which I had never had before in my adult life, of not waiting for someone else's binder to tell me where I fit. I fit here. In this life I built, in this apartment with this balcony and this plant I refused to let die. They thought leaving me behind was a punishment. They were the ones who got left behind.